Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and recorded on Thursday, the 22nd of April. I'm Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator, standing in for Andrew Neil, so wish me luck. On this week's show, we're going to be looking at Joe Biden's first 100 days. We're going to look at the Indian variant of COVID and finding out how much more dangerous it is. We'll have a former chancellor, Sajid Javid, on the Football Super League debacle and a former Swedish Prime Minister, Carl Bildt, about what to make about Putin's ambitions in Ukraine. All that to come in the next hour. And as ever, a very special thanks to Charles Stanley for their support of this programme. Charles Stanley is one of the UK's leading wealth management firms and one of the oldest companies on the London Stock Exchange. We're delighted to be partnering with Charles Stanley. Now first, it's almost been 100 days since Donald Trump left his office. We've had to learn to live without his Twitter feed and his various verbal bombs. But has Joe Biden been doing much better? Freddie Gray writes the cover piece on that this week and joins me now, as does Kate Andrews, our economics correspondent. So Freddie, let's look at the Biden scorecard. Where does it leave us so far?
Well, the scorecard, is probably quite positive if you're a Biden supporter, if you're a Democrat. The vaccine rollout, he's accelerated it. It's been a big success. The COVID relief package has made people happy. Giving people money always makes them quite keen on you, as I'm sure Kate will go on to explain. But there's also been this sort of undercurrent of concern about Biden, and you talked about Trump's inability to stop himself talking. I think Biden has that problem. And I think we saw it this week with the Derek Chauvin trial, where before the jury had announced its verdict, Biden weighed in and said, I hope it's the right verdict, and I think the evidence is overwhelming. There was really no need for him to do that. And it was very strange that he felt this urge to weigh in, because nobody was expecting the president to sort of weigh in on what was a very tense and explosive racially charged moment.
Right. He's also called Xi Jinping a thug. He's called Vladimir Putin a killer. These are words that could have come straight from Donald Trump's Twitter account.
Well, yes. I mean, the difference, I suppose, between him and Trump is that his team are able to keep him hushed up. And they've done a pretty good job of that. I mean, he's only done one press conference. And it went reasonably well. But it wasn't a difficult press conference. I think the Wall Street Journal were allowed one quite critical question. But apart from that, it was really journalists lobbing him softballs.
Right. Now, Kate Andrews, you are, quite a conservative fiscally. You're also almost a British citizen. You've completed the long and winding road down to your indefinite leave to remain, so congratulations on that. But you still open the mail to receive a massive cheque from Joe Biden.
Yeah, I did. I've opened a few checks now from America. One had Donald Trump's name at the bottom, and I thought it might be fake. It kind of looked like Monopoly money. But then I got a second check for $1,400, which is the stimulus, the most recent stimulus. And I thought, oh my gosh, something has gone terribly wrong. How can it be the case that the US Treasury is trying to boost the economy in South London, sending me these checks when they were originally designed for people who were losing their jobs overnight in America, because America had nothing like the generous furlough scheme that exists here in the UK. Now, thankfully, Fraser, here at the Spectator, I was able to keep working throughout lockdown. But if I had been furloughed here in the UK, I would have been taken care of through the furlough scheme. So that money really isn't meant for me. And I think it poses a lot of economic questions about just how much free cash is just flowing around in the United States at the moment. A lot of economists are saying this should come with inflation warnings. We just don't really know what's going to happen this time round when we've done so much money printing. And it isn't just to balance the books. It isn't just to give banks reserves. It's actually going into the real economy, into people's bank accounts. But it presents, I think, ethical questions as well. What exactly do I do with this money? I really think a lot of people out there in America needed it more than I do. At the moment, it's pinned to my fringe, and I'm really torn about what I'm going to do.
Right, but I put it to you, Kate, that people like you have been warning about governments borrowing too much, printing too much money. For a long, long time, the world hasn't fallen apart. In fact, it seems that America is going to do even better than China when it comes to recovering from the pandemic. So maybe Biden is onto something, and people who worry about debt levels have got their mindset in an era where this caused far worse ramifications than it does now, because we're now into the era of modern monetary theory.
Well, I'm not an economist, and I'm not necessarily warning. I'm reporting on those who do. I think a lot of people would say that there has been inflation since 2008 when QE really took off, and it's been an asset crisis. The rich got a lot richer, the cost of homes and assets skyrocketed. But you're right, Fraser, we didn't see inflation in the usual way, and so people are saying now, well, why would it be different? Now, there are a lot of reasons you could say it's going to be different. You could look at the world's economy and say that China thriving and producing its goods, sending its goods out into the world's economy, labor forces emerging all over the world, that's going to be difficult to repeat a second time round. You could look, as I was saying, to those asset prices, and you could say, well, maybe it will just do that this time round. It won't be different. There are a lot of good questions to be asking, but the truth is that the chancellor here in the UK is very worried about this. His budget in March was designed to make the UK's finances Biden-proof, so to speak. He is worried that if there's any uptick in interest rates, in inflation, that the UK could be in a really difficult position to pay its bills. So it's something that really hasn't been spoken about for a long time, because as you say, there was this new theory that everything was going to be fine. You could print as much, spend as much as you want, and there'd be no consequences. But in recent months, a lot of big hitters and the chancellor and economists around the world have been asking these questions because they can sense that something isn't quite right, that at some point we are going to have to address the trillions and trillions of dollars, and here in the UK, many hundreds of billions of pounds that have been spent in such a short period of time.
Now, Freddie, you say in your cover piece that Biden is creating a middle way between the old centre and the new left. From what Kate's saying, if he's spending all of this money, the new left ought to be quite pleased with him so far. So how is that coalition going?
Well, I don't think it works. I think in the piece I said it's a bit like an abusive relationship between Biden and the radical left. He keeps saying things that they want to hear, that he's going to, he'll push for critical race theory in schools, for instance. His administration will do that. And then the radical left, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes of this world, just say it's not enough. It's not enough. And Biden keeps saying, I know it's not enough. We're going to do more. We're on this journey towards effectively a sort of quite radical utopia in America. And they're not satisfied. So, at the moment it's working because he's throwing a lot of money at things. It's the early days of the presidency. But he's not winning over the radical left in any meaningful way.
And Kate, you voted for him because you wanted a unifier, you wanted somebody to dial down the tone of American politics. Have you got, in that respect, what you voted for?
Something closer to it. I think Joe Biden still makes the case for unity far stronger than Donald Trump ever did. I would completely concede, though, that Biden has benefited from much of Trump's very harsh rhetoric, that he didn't have to tone it down too much to still be seen as the better alternative. Fraser, you mentioned some of the language he's been using about world leaders and some of his actions as well. We've been so laser focused on the EU threatening to ban the exports of vaccines that other countries have bought through private companies. Well, the US has done just that. Canada, I think, bought the highest number of doses per resident in the entire world, and they can't get their hands on these vaccines because the US won't send them. It's a very America first policy. But because Trump took that to the extreme, and Joe Biden doesn't use that exact language, he just about gets away with it. So, do I think he's perfect? By absolutely no means. That said, it's difficult to fault in many ways domestically the vaccine rollout. I believe the US has now hit 200 million doses in 100 days of the Biden presidency. Now, in normal times, you would have some bipartisan support for this. Donald Trump clearly laid that groundwork and put the US in a position that we'll be able to manufacture these vaccines and roll them out. Joe Biden is actually doing it. In the good old days, you might have both of these men doing a joint video or a joint campaign to encourage people people to get vaccinated. Obviously not the case now. But Biden, if the only thing he did in his presidency was get the US vaccinated, I think that would be a huge success. The last thing to remember is that the money that he's spending and the work that he's doing, like it or loathe it, from his perspective, he thinks he has 2 years to do it because the midterms are creeping up. They're soon, they're next year, and he doesn't know whether or not his party will get to hold Congress or if the Republicans might take back the Senate. They could hold it. The Republican Party is, crumbles on the floor right now, but it's very, very close already. So from his perspective, he needs to do everything in his presidency of 4 years, actually in 2 years, just in case the Republicans come back, and that makes his life a lot harder to get policies over the line.
Now, Freddie, Barack Obama used the language of unity very much in his presidency, although he turned out to be a very divisive president, perhaps creating the conditions that led to Donald Trump in the first place. How is Biden doing so far in that respect? How are the right, in other words, behaving towards him? Do they feel assuaged? Do they feel listened to? Do the Trump voters, who, let's face it, are half of America, feel that Biden is doing what he can to understand their concerns, or are they itching to get back at him with somebody perhaps even more incendiary than Trump?
Well, I think a lot of the alienated classes of America feel alienated, and there's not a lot Biden has done to address that. I do think as the midterms approach, he may try to become more of a centrist figure. But is that what alienated America is looking for? That's the difficult conundrum he has to answer. I don't think we've seen any sign that he has any good answers for that question.
Freddie and Kate, thanks very much for joining me. Now, meanwhile, on the home front, it's been a pretty busy week, and Katy Balls, our deputy political editor, joins me now. Katy, let's start with the Dyson episode. We've seen texts from the Prime Minister sent to the entrepreneur James Dyson, surfacing, basically promising him tax cuts if he makes ventilators on time. How damaging is this?
Well, we know Labour want to ultimately run a campaign against Tory sleaze in the idea that it will slowly, if not immediately, damage the Tory brand, and I think they see it as a slow build exercise. I think, where does James Dyson fit into that? If we're looking at the text messages over ventilators, I think there is a sense that you were talking about doing things in the Treasury in an unofficial manner. I'm not personally sure how damaging this is. I think a lot of people will just think back to the peak of the crisis, when I think we can all remember that there was a huge concern in the country that there weren't enough ventilators, and it was almost an all hands on deck. I think that when it comes to the various allegations Labour are looking into, is the things outside of that emergency period which have the most potential to hurt the government in terms of Tory sleaze.
But it's been a busy week politically, and the government seemed to have used, especially the football scandal, as a good time to bury some bad news, that there's no longer going to be a on-camera televised briefing, and Allegra Stratton is no longer going to be the face of Boris Johnson's government, as was originally the plan.
Yes, so this is news we've had this week, and I think to many it doesn't feel as a huge surprise. They've been constantly pushed back since Allegra Stratton was appointed into the role 6 months ago, and pushed further and further back. Most recently we were told they'd be in May after the local elections, and now they're not going to happen at all. Why is this? I think we need to remember that her appointment was very controversial at the time within Downing Street. It led to ultimately civil war breaking out. You had the comms chief, Lee Kane, resigning from his role, and Dominic Cummings followed quite soon after, so it really changed the makeup of Number 10.
Right. And also, we had a rather embarrassing episode, but meanwhile they spent 2 million quid on this great glitzy briefing room, which is presumably going to be used, to store junk?
Well, apparently to have press conferences with ministers, on an ad hoc basis. But I do think a lot of people are going to think that was the best use of taxpayers' money. And I suppose when you're trying to work out, well, why have these press briefings been stopped? I think it's down to a number of reasons. I think one of those is if you think back to the fact that this was the brainchild of Lee Kane, but he didn't want Allegra Stratton to win the role. We know that Carrie Symonds, Boris Johnson's fiancée, was pushing for her to get the role, and it all became rather messy. In the end, Lee Kane left, so we had a situation where the person who championed the format was out of the building, but we had someone to do the job, and I think that the fact that there were also people in that building who were quite sceptical about the pros of press briefings, thought there was a lot of collateral damage they could do, meant there was this creep towards, I think, a cancellation. We know there have been rehearsals of press briefings in recent months. I don't think they convinced the second director of comms, James Slack, of their merits. He's now also left. We're now into a third director of communications, Jack Doyle, as of last Friday, and it seems one of his first acts, a decisive one, was to say no to these briefings.
Thanks, Katie. Now, just to say, if you haven't tried the Spectator magazine before, we're offering a £20 Amazon voucher when you take out a trial subscription for £12. Do the maths and it's pretty much uneconomical, but I don't make these offers. Anyway, you can avail yourself of it by doing spectator.co.uk/TV offer, or just Google Spectator TV and it should come up. £12 for 3 months of a Spectator and a £20 Amazon voucher. Now, the worlds of football and politics collided spectacularly this week when England's 6 largest clubs say they were going to break away to form a European Super League. They knew there'd be outrage, they thought the government has no powers to stop them, but the politicians didn't lose much time in saying they would vote to give themselves more powers. Perhaps the biggest threat came from Sajid Javid, the former chancellor and a former banker. He thought he'd come up with a super tax that would penalise them and potentially neutralise any financial advantage to them joining the Super League. Sajid Javid joins me now. Now, you're a former banker, Sajid Javid, and I would say one of the most pro-free market MPs in the party. You've been denouncing industrial strategies and things like that, but here you are, proposing what is, in effect, a punishment tax for companies who do something the government doesn't like. So can you explain your thinking and how you reconcile this with your free market principles?
Yeah, look, I think the thinking starts with the importance of football, the importance of football to our country, to our society. I think most people would agree, the vast majority, that football is part of the DNA of our country. You know, we invented the beautiful game, we exported it around the world. It's part of the social fabric of almost every community in the UK. I remember when I was the culture secretary, that football was very much part of just that, part of our culture. That's why it's overseen by that Secretary of State. And I think that gives it special meaning, as in it's much more than just a sport or just a business. It is really part of the fabric of our country. And so first of all, I'd say as a conservative, that someone who believes in the value of our institutions, in defending them, in our heritage, that it's important to stand up for those values. And I think what was proposed was challenging that. And the other thing is also, as a conservative, but especially one that believes passionately in free enterprise, whether it's low taxes, sensible regulation, I also believe in competition. And what was being proposed was a cosy cartel of elite clubs. There's no prospect for those founders to be promoted or relegated. No matter how badly performed, they would still be in that club. And I think that there's not just anti-competitive, but it also just goes against the sort of the sense of British fair play that we all have. Everyone just knew it didn't smell right, it wouldn't work, and it was just wrong in every way.
Right, but you're also a former financier. You would have seen the very clear financial logic for this. You'll also know that the audience for the football matches is global now. It's not just British. And so you can see here the financial rationale for what they wanted to do. This could have led to a lot more profit for them, a lot more money for the taxpayer. It could have built a British industry even more than it was already. Isn't that the sort of thing which, in another era, Conservatives would have been applauding?
No, I don't think so. I think how Conservatives have reacted to this is consistent with our values, including in the past. If you look at, I think, your previous Conservative governments, and that is because, as I said, it goes to the very heart of what we are as a country, our institutions, our heritage. But it is also much more than a business. Of course, that for the owners of these clubs, I think people can see what they're motivated by. They weren't exactly trying to hide it, which is they're not really fans of their own clubs and stuff. They're fans of money. And for them, it was about, how can they could squeeze even more out of what they just see as a business, a trophy asset. How can they squeeze more? And what they would be looking at, I guess, more than anything, is probably the spreadsheet that's got all their sort of their revenues and then their costs, and they're trying to maximize that profit. And that's why for the government and for anyone that was interested in putting an end to these proposals, it made sense to look at how can you change the dynamics on that spreadsheet. How can you basically splash some more red ink into that spreadsheet so that they are deterred from taking the action that they've set out.
Well, they've now abandoned their plan, but still the government review is going ahead. It looks as if football might be regulated in spite of all this, even if they've done what you pretty much asked them to do. So can't we see another government power grab in action here?
No, not really. I wouldn't be concerned about that. I mean, first of all, they have, as you say, they have come to their senses very quickly and abandoned these plans. I think first and foremost, they've abandoned them because they've seen the real gut reaction of real fans of football, not these owners, but they're real fans. You remember, these are people that often they save as much as they can so they can buy tickets, go and support their club, and they believe in the dream. And these guys were trying to kill that dream. And so the fans stopped this. But I also think what's happened is that the owners heard what the government had to say, what the Prime Minister said, what Oliver Dowden said, and other party leaders as well, that they would take action if they had to. And the government had ways of taking action. I remember when I was Home Secretary, every police force would, I think at some point, contacted me and said, look, we get these big bills for policing these big football matches. And part of the rationale was the taxpayer picks up some of the expense of putting on football matches because there's a commitment to the community. So the government could have changed that equation for them. But I think this super tax proposal also had a real bite to it, because I think the club owners could see that the government could, if it wanted to, we've got a majority. In fact, even without despite the majority, I think within Parliament there's cross-party support. If the government wanted to take action and amend the finance bill that's in front of Parliament right now, and take that kind of action with the tax, then it would have really turned their financial proposals as they see them completely upside down. And I think the prospect of that probably did helped in helping to change their minds as well.
As a former Home Secretary, you were also in charge of the visa process. Is it the case that the government, if it chose to, in the same way that it could choose to charge these clubs for policing, that would make life more expensive for them, couldn't it also choose to not grant, for example, visas for any international players that are transferred? Is that a tool that was at the government's disposal that could have conceivably been used had this scheme went ahead?
Look, that's another example of a potential tool that could have been used. And now that we're outside the EU, we have even more sort of control of who comes in and out of our country. But I think what this shows is that for the reasons I hope that I've set out, and I think the vast majority of MPs, not just Conservative MPs, have really shared, is that this is much more than just about sport or a business. This goes to the very heart of the kind of country that we are. We could see the public reaction and the strength of that reaction, and it's the government's job to respond to that. It fits in very much with Conservative values, whether that's on heritage and institutions or promoting competition. And all those tools that we've talked about over the last few minutes, I think they're all available, whether that's visas, it's the prospect of a different type of regulation, and ultimately taxation.
Right, these are three new tools that didn't exist, or don't exist now. They could have been conjured up, you say. But we often quite hear government wringing their hands thinking, what can we do about, for example, the tech giants who don't pay enough tax, the Amazons of this world? Haven't you just found the answer to that question? If you want to, you can invent tools that can change the behaviour of big private companies. So couldn't you apply this to other big corporations who you don't think are playing by the rules and are not contributing to the social cohesion in a way that you described with football clubs?
I think that there is a big difference, and that is that ordinarily, in normal circumstances, there are structures in place that would deal with, let's say, companies, enterprises that are acting in some kind of unfair way. Let's say on taxation, if the government feels people feel that they're not paying, let's say, their fair share of tax. So you've given a really good example, which is the tech industry, the tech giants. And there are procedures in place already, institutions to help deal with that. So, for example, just taking that, the tech companies, the government has responded to that in an orderly way by introducing a digital services tax. We've done that as a country unilaterally. The government also knows that it requires an international solution. We can't do everything on our own. So through the OECD, through the G7, G20, there's discussions that are going on, which are actually, for what I hear, heading all in the right direction. So that is something that the government can react to through sort of usual procedures that are already in existence and put in place in a let's say, a more orderly way, and that's what happens. And also, if I may say, when it comes to competition as well, in most parts of if you think of just businesses, for most businesses, and as I say, football is much more than a business, but the owners think of it as a business. So from that perspective, for most parts of the economy, there are either existing regulators in place, the utility regulators, for example, and there's also overarching regulators such as the competition authority. I think the difference here was that it wasn't clear that because it's more than just a business, it wasn't clear whether those existing structures would actually do the job. And I think that's why the government was right to say that if we need to go beyond that, we will.
Well, and exactly, and you wonder if this is going to be the last time that governments do this, because right now they've made clear that they are willing to give themselves any powers to regulate any companies, and that will be the question whether we might be entering a less liberal, more interventionist period of government. But before you go, one final question. This whole scheme was going to be bankrolled by JP Morgan to the tune of something like $5 billion. Yet you are an advisor to JP Morgan. You just played a pretty big role in scuppering this whole scheme. Isn't that going to make things a bit awkward at your next JP Morgan meeting?
No, not at all. My advisory work with JP Morgan is about talking about the global economy, the pandemic, global geopolitics. It's got nothing to do with the transactions. And I can say what I like when I like, and that's what matters. The only job that really matters at the end of the day is my job as an MP and looking after my constituents and do my best for this country.
Sajid Javid, thanks very much for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, the Prime Minister has had something else on his mind this week. It's his twice cancelled trip to India. COVID levels there are getting pretty serious. It registered the biggest spike in the world recently. And he figured, perhaps understandably, now is not the best time for a trip. But how much of this is down to the new variant strain of COVID that's been discovered over there? I'm joined by somebody who can distill the facts from the panic. Dr. Jeffrey Barrett directs the COVID-19 Genomics Initiative at the Wellcome Sanger Institute in Cambridge, and he joins me now. Dr. Barrett, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, we've heard a lot about the Indian variants, but what do we know about it, and to what extent is it overwhelming India in the same way that the Kent variants changed the narrative here in Britain and on the continent?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't think we know yet. There is some evidence that this new variant, dubbed B1617, has been growing in frequency in India at the same time as the recent tragic surge. But that can sometimes happen by coincidence, and it doesn't necessarily prove on its own that the new variant is in fact driving that surge. The way we tried to unpick that problem in the case of the Kent variant back in December last year was we could watch, because we do quite a lot of what we call genomic surveillance in the UK, where we sequence the genome of the virus to really carefully track each variant from place to place. And what we saw there was that every time the B117 or Kent variant would arrive in a new place in the UK, it would very rapidly completely take over. And we've seen the same thing happen in other countries in the months since then. So that takes quite a lot of data to build a sort of very compelling picture. And I think right now, we actually just don't have enough information about this new B1617 variant.
Right. And how difficult is it to track? Because the Kent variant, that was detectable by an S gene dropout, which you can pick up through a standard PCR test. Is the Indian variant one that you would need more advanced methods to detect? And is that why there's such a question mark about its prevalence?
That's exactly right. So the Kent variant had a kind of coincidental useful property in that one of its mutations made it, as you said, trackable by a certain signal in the PCR test that we use very widely. And that means we could see it in kind of real time and also in very large numbers of tests conducted in the UK. The B1617 variant in India doesn't have that property. One needs to read the complete genome of the virus in every sample to be certain whether it's present or not. And at the moment, there's a growing but relatively small amount of genome sequencing in India. So they've had over 4 million cases in this current wave, but only published about 1,000 sequences. So it's a tiny proportion, and it can be very difficult to know if that proportion that have been sequenced are representative of the huge number of cases that are being transmitted. And if they aren't, then that means you can't sort of make the leap that the exact proportion we see in the sequence data represents how much is out there in the country as a whole.
Right. Now, there's been a lot said about how this is a double mutant strain, which sounds pretty terrifying. Is it?
Yeah, I think that's really overblown. So all of these variants of concern that we've been looking at, the Kent one, the B1351 from South Africa, the one that was first seen in Brazil, these all have a number of mutations. So the virus has about 30,000 letters in its genome, and usually these variants that seem concerning have 10 or 20 mutations or differences from the ancestral version. The same is true of the Indian variant. It has, I forget, about a dozen, I think, 2 of which are potentially concerning, and those 2 are why someone coined it the double mutant. One of them was previously seen in a variant in California. I'd actually say those 2 mutations that have grabbed headlines are not in the top tier of biologically scariest mutations, compared, for example, to some of the ones in the Kent or South African variants. And for that reason, I think we don't know whether it's very difficult to predict this virus and whether there might be some aspect of its biology we don't understand. But I don't think there's any need to panic right now. I don't think there's any clear evidence, for example, that these mutations would make vaccines less effective against this variant.
How many mutations are there of COVID that we know, or how many can we estimate that there are so far?
So there are many tens of thousands of mutations because these things happen sort of all the time in the virus, in all the transmissions that are happening around the world.
So tens of thousands of mutations. But why should it be that when we see one from Kent, one from South Africa, one from Mexico, that we talk as if the very mutation is reason to worry and there's something going on if there are tens of thousands of mutations anyway?
Well, I think that's a good point, and almost all of the mutations we see do basically nothing to the virus's biological properties and are not interesting, except they can be used as a kind of barcode to track the virus. The reason that we do get somewhat excited about the Indian variant and the Kent one and so forth is that some of those mutations have properties that make them perhaps more worrying. So, for example, when they appear in the spike protein of the virus, that's the kind of most important bit the virus uses to bind to human cells, that is likely more concerning. More recently, there have been a number of laboratory experiments where specific mutations have been tested in viruses in dishes to show that, for example, they can bind more tightly to human cells and infect better, or that possibly they can evade certain antibodies that our immune systems produce. So I think we're getting better at having these predictors of which mutations are a bit worrying and which ones are probably benign.
And meanwhile, we can keep account of them, can't we? I mean, the variant's been here for several months now, since February, and right now I think there's only something like 100 cases being detected. So can we infer from that the Indian variant, whether it's more dangerous or not, is certainly not growing in the way that the Kent variant has pretty much taken over the COVID story in continental Europe?
I think that's likely the case. It's difficult to make a direct comparison because, of course, in the last few months, the country's been under a tight lockdown, and that seems to be driving down the numbers of all variants of the virus, which is very good news. But one thing that's becoming clear is that of the 100 or so observations so far, almost all of them, I think, are either from people who recently traveled from India or the contacts of those travelers. And that means that, in some sense, the early warning system is working. We're detecting that now. We know there's a lot of cases in India. We know a lot of people test positive when they travel from there. And a reasonable fraction of them have this B1617. But it doesn't seem yet to be transmitting onward in the community generally. And I think that's a very good sign so far, and obviously something we have to watch very carefully going forward.
Right. Now, I imagine, well, can you ever see a time where we would not be worried about a COVID mutation? It's argued that as the virus enters its final years, we can in anything expect more dangerous mutations as it seeks to evolve and dodge the vaccines. But I'm thinking that right now, if we're closing our borders, if we are taking very strong quarantine regulations because we're worried about a potential mutation, for the virus of where there are tens of thousands of mutations. I can't quite see the process where this ends and where we would not be worried. From what you're saying, COVID will keep mutating for the rest of its life on this planet, and I can't quite see at what point we stop worrying about mutations.
Well, I think in some sense that's right. We're entering a kind of new phase of the pandemic where there are variants around the world, and we watch carefully and are most interested in knowing if any of those variants are less well neutralized by vaccines. And I think we don't know yet, and that's the reason for concern. That being said, I think it really emphasizes a fundamental point that a number of people from the WHO and others have made, which is nowhere in the world is really safe until everywhere is safe. It is not sensible to think that if the UK successfully finishes vaccinating its entire population, but there are hundreds of thousands of cases per day in India, that the pandemic is somehow over for us. Travel restrictions are one way to try to limit that sort of import and onward transmission in that situation. Obviously, Australia and New Zealand, for example, have been doing that for months already. But I don't think anybody wants to live in a world where we permanently have such strict travel restrictions. And I think that's why efforts to more equitably distribute vaccines around the whole world are so very important.
Sure, but this is what a lot of people can't quite understand. If we end up with herd immunity in this country, the government thinks we're going to get there by October, some think we'll get there earlier, but say if we hit there at one point, isn't the whole purpose there that any variant of COVID, any one of the tens of thousands that you've spoken about, ought not to trouble us, simply because it wouldn't be able to spread, because it wouldn't find enough people to spread to? I can't quite work out why, if we do hit herd immunity, which is the government's strategy, perhaps an undeclared strategy, but if we hit herd immunity through vaccination, why would we then be worried about people bringing COVID into Britain if we're not aware of any mutant strain which dodges the vaccine or causes reinfection?
Well, exactly. That is the X factor, which is there are no variants yet proven to dodge vaccines or cause reinfection, but there are some for which there is reasonable concern or worry that they might be better able to reinfect individuals who've been vaccinated. And that's, I think, hopefully not a very likely outcome, that there will be fundamentally variants that will be able to evade the vaccines at a very substantial level. But obviously the consequence of that is so enormous that I think governments are taking precautionary steps to say, we get to herd immunity, we try to gather as much data as possible to understand if these new variants pose a real threat to that herd immunity, or if there is, for example, a possibility that some of these variants might create some infections, but they'll be relatively mild, possibly unlikely to transmit onwardly, and very unlikely to become severe diseases or death. And that might be something that society can learn to live with. So I think that's the question, is which of those possible scenarios is likely to play out? An unlikely but very bad one where we'd have another wave of a new variant of the virus, perhaps also unlikely but very rosy one where the vaccines work perfectly against every variant of the virus, or something in between where we have to sort of adjust our lifestyle in response to exactly whether there are other variants and how much they might not be as neutralized by the vaccines.
At what point can we declare that we're no longer worried, for example, about the South African variant that was found in some laboratory tests and in some real-world tests to be better at getting through the Astra vaccine, for example? And then there's some studies in Israel recently looking at people who had been infected despite having been vaccinated, and they found far greater prevalence of South African variant than they had thought. But still, if you look at South Africa itself, their cases are down something like 98% from the peak. So I'm not quite sure at what stage we think, okay, we've seen a couple of concerning studies, but realistically it's not that much of a threat. It's difficult to declare with any confidence that whatever new variant it is, be it Indian, South African, Brazilian, is no longer a threat. You're going to get concerning studies that are always going to, aren't they not, give us pause for concern. I just can't quite see when this cycle would end.
Well, I think we will get more informative data. One of the studies that you alluded to in Israel is informative, I think, in that they did see a larger proportion of infections after double dose vaccination of the South African variant, but the total number, if I remember rightly, was something like 8. Yeah. So it's tiny. Perhaps this is where I was going, that it can perhaps get through a bit better, but it's not as if Israel is experiencing a wave right now of South Africa variant getting through their vaccine. So I think that's a good point of confidence. I think you'll see again perhaps some data from the eastern part of France and Luxembourg and Europe have a reasonable amount of B1351, the South African variant. They're also vaccinating quite quickly, so we should get data there. And we'll also be looking very carefully in the UK. Here, we have very low levels of the South African variant in the community, and the government is trying hard to get that to zero with things like the surge testing in South London we saw a week or so ago. But I think what we'll do in the next month or so, as restrictions are lifted, we sequence a very large fraction, more than half now, of all the new positive cases in the country, so we know how many cases of these variants there are, and we'll be able to ask questions like, are we seeing more cases of South Africa now that we're getting close to herd immunity? Are they enriched in the vaccinees compared to other lineages of the virus? And I think you're right that hopefully there will be a kind of drumbeat of reassuring stories that will mean we don't have to be quite as petrified of these variants as we perhaps have been.
Of course, we're talking about vaccines all the time, but a variant which causes reinfection is as much of a risk. Now, it's more than a year since the virus kicked off. How many countries have there been where reinfections have been a feature of the pandemic? I was trying to have a look at reinfection numbers, and they're pretty hard to find. I think there's a Dutch company which tries to list them, and it's got fewer than 150 documented reinfections worldwide. That struck me as a very low number for a virus where there have been tens of millions of infections. So I don't know if your institute has been looking at this in any greater detail.
So we haven't in particular, but we have been contributing data to I think, an important effort to look at this. It turns out to be just very hard to prove reinfection. Sometimes people, for example, shed virus for months after they've been infected at a very low level, and it can look like another infection, but really it's just some kind of unusual tail of their first one. So there have been studies set up to try to find these things. There's one called Siren in the UK, which is a study of healthcare workers, where you can imagine is a good place to look because, one, it's much easier to keep careful records and do things like sequence the genome of every infection to know conclusively this is a different variant than the person got, back in October of last year or whatever. And the other thing is, of course, healthcare workers are exposed more often to the virus than most of us are. So there are efforts to document these numbers. It's still, as you say, these clear-cut cases are small numbers. I suspect there are more in the community. There's an interesting piece of data.
Can you say a bit about what this Siren study has found? If you say that that is Britain's number one reinfection study right now is Siren, what has Siren found about reinfection levels? How many reinfections has it found?
Well, I think what it's found is that previous infection offers, as we would expect, very substantial, I think it's something like 85% reduced risk of getting infected again. And I don't think they found, as yet, any association between secondary infection and which variant is you're exposed to the second time. I suspect that's going to take a bit more time because the sort of types of variants that one has been exposed to in the UK has been shifting over the period in which the study's been running. So, back last fall, it was one particular mix that swept through being Kent to the point where today 99.9% of new infections are the Kent variant, so it's kind of quite difficult to tell them apart. I think there's also some interesting data from the ONS, Office for National Statistics, and Oxford University study, which looks at the general population survey every week. And one thing they've found is pretty consistently there's a way the PCR test measures approximately how much virus is in the sample that you take, and that second infections tend to have less virus than first infections. And I think that kind of makes sense, so that even individuals who do get a second infection probably get a more mild infection. And they also might be less aware that they even are infected the second time around if they don't have strong symptoms. And that might also be a factor for why so far it's been very hard to pin down numbers of reinfections in the community, because the second time around it might be less likely that you notice.
Right. And it's funny, when you pick up the papers abroad, people talk about the British variant, as if it's, which obviously is a major problem for them. But I'm wondering, what do you think the chances are that the British variant actually started in Britain? We do more genome sequencing than any other country in the world, I think, it's fair to say. Isn't it simply more likely that we found it first, but it probably started somewhere else?
Well, I think that was certainly a possibility when we first observed it, for exactly the reason you say. We had a very powerful microscope to look at these things, and so when we found it, it was hard to tell the difference between whether it had originated in Britain or somewhere else. I'm not sure, but increasingly confident it probably did originate in the UK. And the reason for that is it seems to transmit so quickly that if it had arisen somewhere else some substantial amount of time before it in the UK, there would have been a very bad wave there. And in the wake of the discovery of the British and South African and other variants, many, many countries are now doing sequencing, and we haven't yet seen a country turn up where we can look back and say, aha, they probably had a very bad wave that was caused by this. Instead, we usually see it kind of starting in other countries on a lag of months from when it began in the southeast of England. So again, no way to be totally certain, but I think it is reasonably likely that it began in either the southeast, somewhere in Kent, or possibly in the east of London, which is where we saw the very earliest sequences in the UK.
Okay, but so far, I imagine no virus has ever been scrutinised with as much expertise as the coronavirus has. We're not seeing any significant number of reinfections. They seem to be absolutely tiny, and we're not seeing any of the tens of thousands of variants that dodge the vaccine. Might it be fair to say that that's two pieces of reasonably good news?
I think it probably is. I mean, I think we can't be too certain yet that none of these variants are going to be less well neutralized by the vaccines. I don't think we have seen, I think one way to put it would be, we have certainly not yet seen a really bad piece of news about a particular variant and vaccine efficacy in real world data. And as you kind of said before, the longer that time goes by and there are variants out there in countries where there's a lot of vaccines, the more and more that kind of lack of bad news becomes good news.
Dr. Jeffrey Barrett, thanks very much for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, what follows plague? War. Well, that's what James Forsyth says in his political column for the magazine this week. He joins me now. James, you're referring to the build-up of troops in Ukraine, 120,000 Russian troops on the border. Is this real or just for show?
I think the international world order looks particularly fragile at the moment. You have China probing Taiwan's air defences, Iran promising to step up its enrichment of uranium to a level that's very close to what that would be required for a nuclear bomb, and as you say, 120,000 Russian troops sitting on the border with Ukraine. Now, I think Vladimir Putin intends to use this force on the border with Ukraine as a chip. I'm not saying he intends to actively invade Ukraine, but I think he intends to extract something for de-escalating those border pressures. I think it is no coincidence that this is happening at a time when Putin is under not a huge, but some domestic pressure because of the economic situation in Russia and the Alexei Navalny protests.
Right. And your point about this following the pandemic, I mean, do you think there might be a part of Putin thinking, well, the West is recovering from this trauma, I therefore might get away with more than I might have done had I been up to my hijinks a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I also think that the West now faces two simultaneous challenges to the world order from Russia and China. And I think British foreign policy sources are dismissive of the idea that Russia and China are coordinating their actions, but they undoubtedly benefit from the ways in which the West is distracted by the other. For example, I think it's a kind of close to a racing certainty that if China did attempt to seize Taiwan, that Russia would take the opportunity to cause trouble in its own neighbour, to march into eastern Ukraine, for instance. And I think that is one of the things that Vladimir Putin is doing. I think he is also probing to assess Western resolve. I think he will have noted, for example, that Czechoslovakia has made, Prague has made an appeal. Prague has made an appeal for other countries to follow its lead, other EU countries to follow its lead in expelling Russian diplomats, and there hasn't been a coordinated joint expulsion following the Czechs blaming the Russians for an explosion that killed several Czech people in 2014. And so I think that what Putin is doing is assessing how serious the West is, how prepared it is to stand up to him.
I'm joined now by Carl Bildt, a former foreign minister and prime minister of Sweden and a long-standing watcher of the situation in that part of the world. So, Carl Bildt, how delicate is the situation in Ukraine right now? If you look at the sheer number of troops, things look quite sensitive, but I'm not sure if that's a decoy.
Well, we simply don't know. I mean, what we do know is that there has been a very significant buildup of military forces on Crimea for some exercises, but also around the borders of Ukraine. And the most significant military buildup since the acute phase of the crisis in 2014 and 2015. And these are expensive things. I mean, you don't do them for fun. They are there for a purpose, for some sort of thing. And that, of course, creates a certain amount of nervousness.
I imagine also that Putin will be testing Europe's response. Now, we saw that after the incident in Salisbury, Britain succeeded in getting Europe to give a combined response when we expelled Russian diplomats. But this time around, a few days ago, when Czech Republic expelled diplomats, there was not a concerted European response. Do you think that European unity is beginning to fracture?
No, I don't think so. I think what has been happening in the sort of this Russia-Ukraine case now is that the fact that it has attracted so much attention, and we had X numbers of telephone calls to Putin in the Kremlin and to President Zelensky in Kiev offering support, I think that has had a deterrent effect. It has been made clear to President Putin that were he to go further, crossing the obvious red lines, that would have significant consequences. So I think, as a matter of fact, the political action or the political signaling that we've seen during the last few weeks have probably, we have to reserve judgment, have probably been successful.
Right. But we've seen recently, for example, when Joe Biden came in, he was keen that Germany cancelled the Nord Stream 2 project that would expand the pipeline to Russia. The reason for that is that Poland, and indeed the European Parliament, were begging Germany not to go ahead with this because this would allow Putin far greater latitude to get up to more manoeuvres in Ukraine. Germany is still pressing ahead, and that must be a little bit of a problem.
That is a problem. Primarily, I think it's a problem for the German-American relationship. Primarily, I mean, there's, as you are aware of, there's significant opposition in Germany also to this particular pipeline. That being said, there is a significant opposition in Germany to the Americans doing sanctions against an ally. The Germans are saying you can have different views on this one, but that is for us to decide, not for you to decide and try to impose your will. So it is creating tensions. I think the significance of the issue is somewhat overblown, but clearly it's unfortunate.
Okay. Vladimir Putin gave his annual address to the nation a few days ago, and in it he spoke about Russia as being a tiger surrounded by hyenas. Do you think that's how he regards Europe now, as hyenas to his tiger?
I think he creates, I think he has that particular, I mean, my interpretation was, as a matter of fact, that sort of the tiger was more the United States perhaps, and then the other hyenas. But anyhow, that's obviously the way he sees it. But otherwise, I was surprised by his speech because it was so bland, as a matter of fact. Difficult to see that he hadn't thought of the possibility of saying something of a relationship with Ukraine, but there was absolutely nothing in it. And that sort of invites a lot of questions.
One of the theories that James Forsyth advanced in The Spectator is that Putin might be doing the build-up in Ukraine in order to de-escalate later and take some credit for it. For example, we now got Alexander Navalny, who's very ill in a Russian prison. If something were to happen to him, then there would be big reaction, certainly from the West. But James is saying in that case, Putin might say, okay, I'm going to de-escalate Ukraine, and then somehow use that to assuage what would otherwise be a nasty, far harsher reaction to the Navalny situation.
I doubt there's any link between the two. I think these are two different developments. You can perhaps trace them back to the same common denominator, that is that sort of the nervousness in Russia over what's going to happen in September with the Duma elections and the internal instability tendencies that there are inside the regime itself. But otherwise, I fail to see any connection between the Navalny crisis and the Ukraine crisis. We'll see if they de-escalate. I mean, there's a statement coming out of the Russian Defense Ministry today that they are sort of starting to withdraw forces. Well, they've done that from Syria or announced that from Syria, I don't know how many times. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
How much of this do you think Putin is simply testing new leadership in the world. We've got Joe Biden, we've got new leadership in the European Union. Do you think he's just prodding to see how people react?
I think he's primarily prodding the Ukraine leadership. I think he is irritated with Ukraine leadership. They have not, from his point of view, been delivering the concessions that he had been hoping for. And they have also lately taken some rather firm actions against his close political allies in Ukraine. I think that has irritated the Kremlin quite substantially. And I think the primary signaling here is towards Kiev. To a certain extent, perhaps against Brussels and Washington, although I think rather that he believes that those relationships are so rock bottom at the moment that it doesn't make much of a difference anyhow what he does.
And what kind of signal do you think Kiev is getting from Europe in general? Because right now, if you see the Merkel government pressing ahead of Nord Stream 2, then you do wonder just how important Ukraine's protection, that Ukraine's part of Europeans near abroad really is. It might seem as if Europe isn't really much of a position to do anything coherent at all because Putin's successfully playing one country off against another.
Well, I think it's been a fairly unified response. There has been telephone calls from Chancellor Merkel, from President Macron, from President Niinistö of Finland, and they've all been, I understand, very clear that if he crosses the red lines, there will be significant steps taken by the European Union.
Right, but can we define significant steps here? I mean, anybody can make phone calls. What kind of significant steps could we plausibly see the European Union take?
No, I think that if there were to be sort of open aggression, I mean, that's the worst case analysis. First, there would be very close coordination between Brussels and Washington, London, I would assume as well. And the measures that can be taken, those would be financial sanctions. I mean, the Americans took some action the other day. They were extremely mild. And I think one of the reasons the American sanctions the other day were so mild was that they want to send the message, well, we can do these things. And we have a lot of room left in terms of that. And if that is done coordinated across the Atlantic, it can have a very significant effect on the Russian economy, and they know that.
Right. But Putin annexed Crimea a few years ago. He's got away with that. He's been effectively waging war in eastern Ukraine for years now, with something like 14,000 dead. He's also got away with that. So you can understand why he might think he might be able to get away with a little bit more before there's any serious response from NATO or from the EU or anybody in the West.
But I think the sanctions that have been decided already, there's a lot of discussion on this, have they worked or have they not worked? They have not worked in terms of having him roll back and sort of give back Crimea and give back Donbass. He hasn't done that, but it hasn't gone any further. And I think that's a recognition of the fact that these sanctions have had an effect. They have an effect on sections. I mean, they're not total trade sanctions by no means, but they have a financial effect on access to financial markets. They have an effect to Russia's ability to access certain key high technologies that they need also for their energy and other related developments. So I think there's an awareness of the fact that sanctions aren't killing Russia, but they're creating quite a lot of problems.
Right, but I mean, domestically, Vladimir Putin seems to be quite solid right now. The protests about Navalny's treatment do seem to be speaking for a minority of Russians. There was one poll showing a third of Russians think that he wasn't poisoned at all, but further 20% think that Navalny was the victim of some kind of Western plot. So it seems that domestically, Putin's pretty stable.
Well, I wouldn't say pretty stable, but a reasonably stable. What you see is a significant divide in Russia that is opening up between what I call the television generation. I mean, the elder generation that sort of are dependent upon what is said on television. And of course, what is said on television, I mean, we're all fairly aware of what is said on television in Russia. But then you have the younger generation, that's the internet generation. They don't watch television. They access information through YouTube, which is and there's also Telegram and related cables channels in Russia. So you see the internet generation being sort of increasingly sort of critical, while the television generation, which is still bigger, still sort of enthusiastic or reluctantly supporting Putin.
Well, Carl Bildt, thank you for joining us on our YouTube television today. That's it from the week in 60 minutes. Today I'd like to thank Charles Stanley, our sponsor, one of the oldest companies on the London Stock Exchange. If you've got any comments, we'd always love to hear them. Please email SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. Thanks for watching, and thanks to our producers Cindy Yu and Max Jeffrey.